Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'd like to share a card that I've created with the new release stamps from So Suzy Stamps. I'm using a fairy on a swinging stamp as well as some old favorites. They're actually called herbs, and I forgot to show the sentiment stamp, but I will be showing it later in the video, so stay tuned. As you can see, I'm using some masking paper to create a circle mask for the moon that will be one of the focal points for the background. I'm going to be using several colors of Distress Oxide and actually some Distress inks to create this background. First, I'm starting by sponging on the worn lipstick, which is going to be covering the entire background of the card, including right up to the edge of the circle. And as you're going to notice as I move through this, since I'm using the Oxide inks, once I've put down that first layer of color, even when I come back in and start using a different color, which you'll see when I switch to Concord Grape in a moment, that there's really no problem with blending it in, even though it's going to look like a bit of a hot mess at the moment. So that you're just about to see after I put down the outside glow for the moon. So I'm using Scattered Straw, and this is a Distress ink. It's not an Oxide, and I'm just sponging that around the edges to create a glow coming out from the moon. I'm using a paper towel in order just to keep my hands a little bit cleaner during the process and not unintentionally get ink in places that I don't want it to be. So there's a first view of what the glow looks like. And now I'm switching over to the Concord Grape. And as I said before, it's going to look pretty blotchy when I first start putting it down, but don't worry, it's actually going to work out just fine. So if you'll just bear with me, you'll see how that ends up working out. The main thing is, like I said before, the Distress Oxides are very forgiving as far as blending in. So even though I'm adding the ink right on top of that, I'm going to pick up the sponge dauber with the worn lipstick color. And then I'm going to go back over the edges and blend that in so that there's a much smoother transition. I'm not necessarily going for super perfect here for the transition, but just so that it doesn't look so obviously different between the two colors. And once I've done that, I'm going to create some ground at the bottom, and I'll use two different colors of Oxide inks. First it'll be the Vintage Photo, and then I'll switch to a little bit of peeled paint. In order to create the ground, I didn't want a straight surface, so I took a piece of paper, tore it across randomly to create a simple mask for the bottom. And then I'll apply the walnut stain quite liberally at the bottom. And as a final touch, I'm just going to touch across the top edge with the peeled paint Distress Oxide. And as I'm showing in this photo, this is my storage system for keeping Distress Oxide ink pads stored. They're actually mini quiche trays that I've kept because I happen to love mini quiches, and then I discovered that the little trays are actually very useful in the craft room, and especially for storing these ink pads. Makes it very easy to keep things neat in the craft room. And I used to store these ink pads actually on the bottom of my new Distress Oxides just to find they made such a huge mess in where I was storing them. So that's what kind of led to that change. And now, as you see, I'm applying a little bit of a yellow color. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was. I believe it was Wild Honey, and I applied it to the moon with a very, very light hand. So I didn't want to saturate it all with that color, just wanted it to have a hint of that warm golden glow. And now I'm preparing to stamp the Swinging Fairy, and pulled out my Misty to prepare for that. I did pull out the mouse pad because this is a cling stamp and you need the extra space on the inside of the Misty. So as you can see, I'm using black archival ink to stamp the fairy on, and it took me a good 3 tries to get a good enough impression because I wanted it to be as solid as I possibly could get it. And I probably could have chosen some other types of ink, but I just ended up choosing archival ink because I felt like it was going to cause me the fewest problems whenever I had to take a couple of extra steps. And one of them was, since that swing is just kind of looking at this point where it's just suspended in the air, I needed to do something to not make it look like it's just floating out there. So before I actually start stamping on the leaves at the top to give the impression of a tree, I took a black Copic marker. I'm going to use it to extend those ropes on the swing, and I zoomed in a bit so you could see that in process. Since the ropes are pretty irregular in appearance, I didn't have to worry too much about making those lines real straight. And then I'm moving on to stamping all the leaves from actually what these stamps are called Herb 1 and Herb 2, but they did a great job of creating the impression of a tree, because otherwise it just kind of looks like that swing's just sitting out there with anchored to nothing at all. And what I did is stamped each time I moved the stamp, I stamped it first with the peeled paint, and then I went back over and just applied some of the walnut stain over it. I didn't completely cover it with the walnut stain because I still wanted the green to kind of show through above it. And then now you see I've switched to the larger of the two herb stamps and repeating the same process. I will then move over the whole panel so that I can repeat this on the left hand side. Now I'm preparing to stamp the sentiment in the bottom left hand corner, and this is the new sentiment stamp I was talking about at the beginning of the video but forgot to show. So I'm also going to be stamping this in the same archival ink that I used earlier to stamp the fairy and the wings with, and I stamped it twice just to make sure it was nice and dark. And the next step I took before finishing off the card is I noticed that the edge of the dress on the fairy looked a little faded as it was coming off the moon. So I'm using the black Copic marker again in order to darken that area. And I extended it into part of the stamp just to make sure that it didn't look odd, that one part was noticeably darker than other sections. So I went throughout the stamp just trying to darken the areas and make it less obvious that I'd had to come back in and fix that. So there's a tip if you happen to notice later on that your stamp didn't quite work out like you thought it had at first. So as you can see, I'm adding some sparkle to the fairy wings. I'm using a clear Spectrum Noir sparkle pen in order to add just that little touch of sparkle and, I don't know, fairy dust, if you want to think of it that way. I don't know that it's going to show up very well in the video, but in real life it actually is very pretty and sparkly. So the final step is I'm taking a piece of 110-pound black cardstock and I cut it into what is the A6 standard card size. That's a 4.5 wide by 6.25 inch long card base, but since my panel looked a little odd in that space, I decided to trim off the bottom of the card base so that it looked a little bit better as far as framing it. And the final touch is adding some Tombow double-sided adhesive. I'm going to place it onto the card base, press it on, and that is a completed card for today. If you're interested in any of the supplies used for the stamp, you may check out the links there below the video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. That way you don't miss out on any future videos. Thank you, and I'll see you again next time.